English literature no longer makes the top 10 of A-level subject choices. English departments at universities are regularly closing. Studies show dramatic drops in literacy and reading, particularly amongst teenagers. So today we're asking, is English literature dying? James, give us the overview of what's happening, particularly in universities.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of factors at play. Obviously, a phenomenon like this is sort of multifaceted. The first interesting thing to say is that English literature is relatively recent as a degree subject. I think it's quite common for us to view it as a kind of eternal pillar of the curriculum that's always been at the centre of the university. That's just not true. It arrived at the beginning of the 20th century in Oxford and Cambridge, spread to other universities, was viewed quite often as a kind of ludicrous soft option. Collini's book is full of classicists sneering at how preposterous it is that anybody should bother having to study a poem or a novel that's written in their own language, which they speak every day. That seemed totally stupid to people. And universities have, in their history, there have been several subjects that have taken this kind of central status in universities, which I think it's true to say literature did assume in the post-war era. So the medieval university was dominated by theology and law, for instance. Theology was the queen of the sciences. Law was the kind of number one vocational or quasi-vocational course for medieval students at universities. The dominant subject of the 19th century was classics. And there are arguments you can make, I make them in the piece, that the kind of preeminent subject in the university, in the Western university, sort of speaks to a wider, this is why it's so interesting, it speaks to wider cultural factors. So you might say, and people have, that the dominance of classics in the Victorian era spoke to a Victorian preoccupation with Western civilization, Victorian preoccupation with the Roman Empire, the British Empire was a kind of historical echo of it. And I think literature, especially in its golden age in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, was adopted.
Is that a golden age in Britain, or is that an American golden age?
In Britain and America.
Okay.
Was adopted as the kind of, by some people, by some critics, especially Lionel Trilling, literature was viewed as the kind of ideology of liberalism. Trilling wrote a book which amazingly in the 1950s was a bestseller in America called The Liberal Imagination. And part of the sort of implied argument of that book, and Trilling made it more explicitly elsewhere as well, is that literature and the study of literature is a fundamentally liberal enterprise because literature acquaints us with the diversity of human character, the uniqueness of human character, and we understand different points of view, we understand different people, and literature fulfills this function as this sort of liberal subject, which in the Cold War was viewed as a kind of important bastion against the totalizing ideologies behind the Iron Curtain. I think literature's lost its capital and its status in that sense, probably unsurprising to a degree. No subject is going to dominate a university forever. I think it's arguable that it's been replaced by subjects like psychology. I think people come to psychology for what they might have once gone to literature for. So that's part of it. And that's, I think, part of the natural development and evolution of universities. And that's, I guess, would make me sad, but is fine. I think the bigger story that makes it more different and more interesting is that it's simply that people are reading much less than they once did. There are various statistics that show this. And the decline of literature, I think, is most interesting to me as a kind of casualty of the end of the culture of reading, which has been a central feature of our civilization since the invention of the printing press, and especially since the end of the 18th century when reading really spread, beyond elites and into the middle class and further down society. And I guess it's kind of what we mentioned earlier.
You've brought a cheat sheet. Sorry.
Yeah, I have all kinds of depressing statistics.
I'm taking your mask off for the
no, but
there
are so many bleak statistics I couldn't possibly memorize them all. That's how bad it is.
So let's have a couple of the statistics, if you will, James.
So there's been some really interesting work on this recently because I think people are waking up to it. But there's a survey last year that found more than a third of adults who said they once read regularly for pleasure no longer do so. There's another report earlier this year from the National Literacy Trust, which reports shocking and dispiriting falls in children's reading for pleasure. Children's reading has never been lower. The number of 8 to 18-year-olds reading for pleasure has halved in the last 2 decades. And I think the really alarming thing that shows this is not just the province of moaning opinion columnists finding something to be cross about is a report from the OECD released at the end of last year, which found that literacy was declining and stagnating in most OECD countries, which is a really remarkable finding. If literacy is declining in a developed country, that would imply some kind of, you'd think there'd been some sort of economic shock or war or the education system had collapsed. in fact, I think what we're seeing is the replacement of the culture of the book by the culture of the screen. This is accelerating with the advent, I think, especially of short-form video, TikTok. People are reading much less than they did. And this is I just think, unbelievably important and interesting cultural change that we're right in the midst of. And the collapse of the English literature degree and its significant decline is a sort of canary in the coal mine for this much deeper, much more dramatic cultural trend that I think is basically the most important and the most interesting thing that we're living through as a society right now.
Tanjil, how does that make you feel?
Interesting. Let me ask you this, James. You have spoken fairly neutrally about the fact that a change is happening. But is this change good or bad? And let's put your cards on the table here. I mean, you think they're negative changes, right? But let me ask you why? Why is it such a bad thing?
I mean, I guess, I would personally feel sad about the decline of the English literature degree. People have made various, I think sometimes somewhat extravagant arguments about the importance of studying literature. It makes us more moral. It's, as the Lionel Trilling argument, is the foundation stone of liberalism.
But what do you think? I mean, you mentioned Trilling. I mean, Trilling says that, I think he uses the phrase something like that literature illuminates the moral experience, and it helps us sort of basically think about right and wrong, a kind of moral reasoning. Do you agree with that? Do you share that view?
Yeah.
I buy it part way. Specifically to do with literary texts, I think there's probably some truth in it, but I'm a little bit skeptical of some of the more extravagant claims that have been made for literature, specifically. I think the sort of thing that I do really believe is that a culture of reading, it doesn't necessarily have to be literature, it could be non-fiction as well, or text that we might not count as literary, has been vital to the development of democracy. I think there's a book, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, which is a kind of Bible to me. And one of the arguments that book makes is that we can default into thinking of democracy as this sort of abstract ideal that has fallen into our laps out of history from nowhere. He points out that democracy is the product of a particular culture, which was the incredibly textual culture of the 19th century. It's where modern democracy arrived. And the case of that book is that without a culture of print and without a culture in which politics is debated in print, he makes several, I think, very convincing arguments for the importance of print to political life. It has this sort of distancing, formalizing effect that lowers the temperature of debate. It favors more complex arguments. You can't just assert stuff in print in the way that you can on TikTok or on TV. And I think, the decline of the English literature degree, sad personally to me, maybe not a civilizational catastrophe. The wider thing that is a symptom of the decline of literacy and the replacement of literacy by like video and internet, I think is a catastrophe. And I think a lot of the sort of unhappy and depressing things that we're seeing playing out in our politics can be traced to the decline of reading. I think that's a disaster.
I suppose it would be very easy to find societies in history that have had printed material that have been led in some cases by very literate people, people who could write, people who wrote poetry, people who read novels, people who reviewed plays and operas. And you could open the lid on that society and find a sort of steaming cauldron of prison camps, jackboots, barking dogs, barbed wire, which I think is when Tanjil were discussing George Steiner's sort of rebuttal to the argument that highly literate people are moral is, I mean, obviously the very clear ones are, the Nazi Holocaust, and I don't know if you mentioned Stalin, but again, those Politburos were full of very cultured people.
There's a very interesting book by a woman called Lynn Hunt called The Invention of Human Rights, and part of her case is that our modern notions of human rights to some degree derive from the advent of the novel in the 18th century, that before the novel, people had not been in the habit of assuming other consciousnesses, putting themselves in other people's shoes. And one of the crucial things the novel did for politics was to get people in the mental habit of seeing the world from other perspectives, and therefore beginning to understand that there were kind of multiple competing moral perspectives. Other people had dignity and rights, and those things weren't just things that sort of pertain to your like social class. I never quite know how much I buy that argument, and there's always a chicken and egg thing with, does reading make you a better person? Is it often just the case that more emotionally aware and empathetic people are drawn to novels in the first place. You can do it either way. I guess the other thing is that people who try and talk about the role of changing media in politics are often accused of technological reductionism, of saying that everything in society can be reduced to changing communications technologies. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people who've discussed the arrival of the printing press, Elizabeth Eisenstein is
the
preeminent example.
Famous example.
She wrote
of this
an amazing book. I think The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, which discussed the way that the invention of printing in the 15th century had transformed science, had transformed religion, had transformed philosophy, had transformed politics. And she was often accused of being a technological reductionist, saying that all you had to do in Europe to change Europe was to introduce this new technology which could print loads of books proliferated, and everything, the whole of Europe changes. She, I think, rejected that charge and said there were just so many factors. And I think when we kind of look at the chaos of modern politics, which is something that I often would blame on iPhones and social media and the internet, I think those are certainly factors. It's also important to say, I'm not saying that without iPhones, the financial crash would have had no impact on our politics, or the offshoring of American jobs would have had no impact on our politics, or the kind of current debates of immigration would not exist. These are all separate factors.
I think it's in a way it kind of lets lots and lots of people off the hook. If we say that sort of phones caused Trump, that means you don't really have to think about the disastrous Iraq war that Bush initiated and was supported by many people in the Democratic Party. I mean, as you say, there are many factors and it's complicated. Should we just go quickly back to the university, because that's so much of this this essay is about the university. I reading it, I thought, I think I've never really believed that English literature is a degree subject. I know that makes me sound like a terrible. I don't mean that for snobbish reasons. I've just always thought of literature less as a kind of quest for meaning and more as a way of entertaining myself. And so purely selfishly, I've always thought that it's quite odd to study entertainment. To me, you want to be entertained. I don't think, Dickens sort of sat there. I think possibly he wanted to instruct people, but he also wanted to entertain them. And so I see this at least this part of your argument, which is about the end of English literature at universities, as that might actually be good for English literature. It may weed out the people who are only interested in a kind of credentialism that the modern university provides, and it may return people to just a pure enjoyment of literary art.
Yeah, I have to say, I think that's a very good point. It's a question that's dogged English as a subject since its invention. Stefan Collini has this lovely phrase: the English degree is the curious marriage of beauty and the footnote. Like, why do we need footnotes to appreciate a poem? Why do you have to go and people, thousands upon thousands of people read Dickens entirely for fun. A lot of them were not educated at all.
They were illiterate.
Why do we need to study that at university? And it's a question English has never quite got over. And I think it's this slight anxiety about what exactly English is for that has made it a subject onto which an awful lot of stuff has been projected. Mm-hmm. In the middle of the 20th century, people were making moral claims for English that now sound amazingly extravagant. Yes. I mentioned Lionel Trilling, who kind of had this idea that English might be the sort of doctrine of kind of part of the doctrine of liberalism. F.R. Leavis really majored on the idea that English was morally improving. The great tradition, could be a kind of morally worthwhile thing to study. George Eliot and people like Conrad and people like that. And I think you're right to say this has been a bad thing for literature, because if you want to go, if it's attached, got all this other stuff attached to it. And I think the ultimate development of that for literature has been that it has to be justified in other terms. And so suddenly people think, oh, well, I'm studying literature not because it's valuable in itself, but because it makes me a good person. And I think that is probably, if you were to trace it back, the beginning of another problem for the subject, which I mentioned in the piece, which is that it's sort of become a branch of the social sciences. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what you'll study on some English courses nowadays is to do with how the canon was politically constructed, mm-hmm. and what various nefarious political stuff were people up to when they said that you had to study John Milton, not somebody else. And I think this sort of kind of feeling that literature has to be a moral thing has been quite corrupting for it, and has kind of moved, as you said, moved people away from the point. We should be, it is ultimately a form of entertainment.
It's pleasurable
Yes,
to
and
read.
we've lost that. And of course, the other kind of woeful consequence is that people who've done English literature degrees then go on to write novels, or writing novels, thinking, might this novel be studied someday? And therefore, you end up with a lot of, I think, slightly dry, slightly academized fiction, which has probably been bad for fiction as an art form. I think there are people who kind of write novels nowadays thinking that they're going to attack certain issues so they can be studied in university seminar rooms. And I think actually sometimes too much education can be bad for a novelist, and people shouldn't be writing literature thinking, how can this be studied? A huge problem in poetry. Poets, love the idea that maybe their work will make it onto like the contemporary fiction module at some university. It doesn't really result in good poetry.
It sounds dreadful. Tanjil, on that question of the sort of moralization of literature, first, as James said, almost as a kind of prophylactic against the Eastern Soviet barbarian, and then later, I suppose through the 80s and into the 90s and today, that moralization coming all the way back around, and then sort of sitting in the seminar room with Conrad's Heart of Darkness, for instance, and saying, good Lord, look at that language. That is extremely problematic. How do you read that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the fundamental basis of teaching literature as a sort of civilizing, moralizing mission, whether that was right or wrong, has completely been subverted. Where instead of reading, say, Conrad's Heart of Darkness and trying to put yourself in the mind of the other characters, you think about it only through a sort of contemporary perspective that makes sense to you. And this is the trouble that a lot of students have with English, and I found this myself when I taught it, that they simply can't enter into the world of the classics, which might be at least 50, usually more than 100 years before their own time, and the curriculum is based around the classics, and so it just doesn't make sense anymore, unfortunately. Whether it made sense to begin with is also another question, but
I think it isn't. I mean, isn't when you're teaching? I've been a teacher as well. I mean, the thing you want is to get them in the habit. This sounds terribly shameful for somebody who works at the New Statesman, but I don't think I read a 19th century English novel before the age of 18. I maybe at school, but I read Shakespeare. But I really, really, I had to be sort of press ganged into reading Jane Austen. I thought, why do I have to read Jane Austen? And then eventually I did, and I thought, oh no, Emma is actually incredibly good.
Yeah, so. And you have to realize that yourself. And
yes,
I really do believe that. I don't think any of this can be experienced as a duty. Once something is primarily experienced as a duty, that's it. That's gone. I mean, there's no point lamenting it anymore at that point. You have to experience it for yourself, and that was my own experience. I wasn't really introduced to literature through teachers or school. It just somehow came to me, and that was great. That was a great blessing in my life. But I don't think it can be forced. It has to be experienced. For pleasure.
Okay. We've been talking about English literature, and your very strongly argued essay that English literature is sort of dying. That's not great news. But I wanted to challenge you a little bit on it, in the sense that there are many times in the history of English literature where people say that it's dying. To take an example at random, I was reading this last night. I immediately thought of you. This is from Malcolm Muggeridge, who I think did work for the New Statesman many decades ago, then converted to Catholicism and became a kind of TV vicar. But he has a wonderful memoir, which is extraordinarily well written, called The Green Stick, Chronicles of Wasted Times. That gives you an insight into what he thought about his life. So just a little quote from Muggeridge. In the 20th century, the genius of man has gone into science and the resultant technology, leaving the field of mysticism and imaginative art and literature almost entirely to charlatans and sick or obsessed minds. He then goes on to quote Gore Vidal, who pointed out, it is difficult to think of a single contemporary American writer of any note who is not either an alcoholic or on the way to becoming one, which is a slightly different thing.
And that's a problem that's dogged literature for much longer.
And journalism. So what's new about now? You brought up Postman. Postman was writing about television in the 80s, and Reagan was the big bad guy. I suppose now we talk about, TikTok and Trump, and he's the big bad guy. But what is it about this very moment that makes you think, okay, English literature actually is dying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the kind of statistical evidence. It is true that people have always worried about it and complained about it. But as I always say, the idea that the existence of past moral panics automatically invalidates a present moral panic is a logical fallacy. Mm-hmm. Just because people have worried about something in the past doesn't mean that you should never worry about that topic again. Something else that people constantly put to me is and you were mentioning it in the break there, the moral panic around novel reading in the 18th century, which was described in very similar terms to the way that people worry about TikTok nowadays. Mm-hmm. Young women were addicted to novels. They were missing out on life because of novels. They were entering dangerous fantasy worlds in novels that were disconnecting them from reality. And it kind of occurred to me, I was thinking about this last night, and I was thinking about this Lynn Hunt book, The Humanitarian Revolution. And there really is an argument that some of those moral panics around novels in the 18th century were kind of justified. If you believe that the novel was an agent of the advent of human rights mm-hmm. and the destruction of the old aristocratic, hierarchical ancien regime in Europe, people have, it was quite commonly said at the time that Rousseau was a cause of the French Revolution. If you believe that, people were quite right that novels were destroying society. If they were spreading this idea of human rights, they were potentially a factor in the erosion of the ancien regime in Europe, which I think we'd now all view as a good thing. But
speak for yourself, James.
Some of us would view as a good thing.
Tanjil's happy with the regime.
Some of us would view as a good thing. But, the media, which we absorb, really, really can change society. And I think it is changing it now. And I think the thing that's different now is that we have evidence for it. Mm-hmm. Not only these surveys, but the statistics like that OECD report, that's kind of unprecedented in recent history, that literacy is declining, like people's ability to engage and interpret complex texts is declining. That's pretty much a first, mm-hmm. I think, in the kind of modern history of Europe. And I think that says this is more than a moral panic.
So I suppose, Tanjil, there's one thing that this makes me think, which is that at some level, people are probably read and write more every day than they ever have. It's possible to go through the day, not actually see anybody, but communicate extensively with the written words to 100 or 200 people. I mean, you can have days where you're just on your phone, just da-da-da-da-da-da. Now, I'm not sure how that quite relates to literature, but I'm always a bit skeptical about, are we less literate or more literate? Is it not the case that we could argue that simply the means of communication, as you say, James, have changed, but it doesn't necessarily follow that people are their literacy is different, basically.
Yeah, definitely their literacy is different. And I guess what James is talking about isn't simply the written word, but a particular tradition of the written word that involves, quite long and complex texts that engage, a level of morally complex thinking. And, I think it's fair to say that, if our sort of media landscape consists of short form videos, short text messages, that kind of thing, there is less moral complexity. There's also, just at a cognitive level, it's also less cognitively enriching, like mentally sort of poorer, mentally more impoverished. So there's, I guess there's two angles to this moral panic. There's a moral panic about morality itself, about people will become worse people. There's also a moral panic about intelligence and sort of intellectual decline. Now, I think intellectual decline, I don't really care that much about. It's hard to, I personally care, but it's hard to make sort of too many claims about that. But it's the moral decline that seems like the more hazardous risk. But I'm not sure how convinced I am by that. If we think of, a lot of the great moral teachers in, the history of human civilization, were not literate. Jesus didn't write a book. Socrates, was probably illiterate or possibly illiterate. Certainly didn't write a book, didn't like literacy.
Yeah.
Buddha was probably illiterate. Morality can exist outside of literacy, which I'm sure you appreciate.
Could I quickly come back on your point about the proliferation of text online?
Yeah, of course,
which was often made about 10, 15 years ago, the height of Twitter. A lot of people's experience of the internet was writing and reading Facebook statuses. there's an analogy that's been made, which I think is a useful one with the advent of print, which is that for the first 50 years after the invention of print, printing, the culture of print aped the culture of manuscripts. The Gutenberg's books and the books of other early printers were made to look like manuscripts. They were often still illustrated by manuscript illustrators. And the first decades of printing were kind of an imitation of manuscript culture. I think something similar has happened with the internet. I think for the first decades of wide internet usage, people have used the internet in a very print-based way. Yeah. People have used the internet to read long-form articles. People have used the internet to write. I think we're moving out of that phase, and I think we're moving towards what the internet will come to be, which is non-text-based. And I think actually the real cultural revolution of the internet is happening now, and I think it's the advent of short-form video. And I think the internet's role as a text-based medium is declining rapidly. I kind of wonder how true it even is that younger people are necessarily texting constantly or will be texting constantly in 10 years. Things might be going more towards voice notes. We know that AI companies, I think, are very keen to stop us texting and writing answers and reading answers. And they kind of, the ultimate vision for AI is that it will be a kind of visual medium or an audio medium that will talk back to you. So I think the idea of the internet is kind of in some way text-based is somewhat premature. I think the textual nature of the internet came because it arrived in a very heavily print culture.
But then surely the scarcity of text produced by human beings in this very spooky scenario, the scarcity of that text will make it more valuable.
Or irrelevant.
I
mean, illuminated manuscripts continue to be made for up to a century after the invention of printing, and I guess still are in some places. They are very valuable. They're also totally culturally irrelevant.
Yes. So
just to really depress everyone.
No, I think it was Don DeLillo who said somewhere that sort of the more marginal literature became, the better it would be for writers. It was better to be on the outside looking in.
It's very easy to say when you're Don DeLillo and you're not really having to worry too much about making a living from it anymore.
I suppose so, but I think there was some value in the observation in the sense that was it good for, was Lionel Trilling right? Not really. Was it good that, American literature sort of created these monstrous figures like Updike? Were they particularly worthy of veneration?
It's true, and it's arguably historically quite weird for literature to have been a mass cultural medium.
Yes.
And the advent, the kind of explosion of reading at the end of the 18th century produced a lot of anxiety about this stuff from writers. The sort of business model of writing before then had been like, you wrote a few poems for your patron, he said very nice poems. And in the 17th century, you might have been embarrassed for those poems to be printed. You wouldn't have wanted to have a mass market appeal. And I guess historically, especially that late 20th century moment when like actual, what we would consider relatively highbrow literature had this sort of mass appeal, that's quite a kind of historically weird thing to happen. And arguably we might look back and think that did weird things to art, although very good things to writers and probably good things to readers too.
Yes.
What replaces literature in your view? Because people have always had culture of some kind. People have always had stories, even oral traditions and so on. I mean, how do you see the future? I mean, how will people be getting their stories?
I think the future is short form video. In the longer term, God knows what the future looks like with the advent of AI. I think that will change things in ways that we probably would be unwise to speculate over.
Virtual reality?
Virtual reality, perhaps. I mean, the thing is, I sort of despise TikTok and would be reluctant to praise it at all. I did briefly have the app in a spirit of cultural exploration. And I can see why it's entertaining. I think it's total slop, and I think it's a very dangerous thing to put into your mind. But TikToks are funny. They're entertaining. Some of it, I reluctantly will grudgingly concede, is like clever and made by clever, funny people. Some of it, people will have that. I think it'll be much less good for them and much less intellectually nourishing and stimulating than literature. Sadly, the choice is in front of us all every day, and a lot of people make the choice that they prefer, to sort of feed TikTok slop into their brains than read books. And, we might think that's like an appalling and crazy decision to make. It's one being made all the time. Look around you on the tube. We don't necessarily have to have a complex culture. It's been nice that we've had one. We've been very used to it, but it could very well disappear. The money in Silicon Valley and the economic incentives of these enormous corporations to take up as much of our attention as they possibly can. I'm very pessimistic about the idea that human beings can do much to resist that force.